So today I want to talk a bit about the self. In particular, the way that some of the results from contemporary science, scientific experiments, and so on seem to confirm some of the basic tenets behind Buddhist non-self. Indeed, some of what I'm going to discuss today even perhaps goes slightly beyond what we think of as Buddhist non-self, at least if we're only looking at the information from the suttas. So what I want to do today is to delve into some of that. I'll begin with one illustrative example, and then I'm going to discuss what I would term the vagueness of the self. That will be sort of the topic of today's video, about the vagueness of the self. And we'll look at vagueness at the beginning, at the end, and even along the middle. That is what constitutes the self, looking again at some of the results from contemporary science. Then I'll turn to a bit of a discussion of vagueness itself. In other words, what vagueness really means in philosophy, and turn to an example of one contemporary philosopher who has used some of these same kinds of arguments in his discussion of the self. Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. So I'm going to begin with this example. An example, a story of a woman back in the 1970s. We only know her by the name Vicky. Vicky was dealing, so it seems, less and less successfully with severe epilepsy. And it got so bad at the time that she really could not function properly. There was no obvious answer to how to cure her of this disease until one rather radical option came forward. This was the option of severing the two sides of her brain. It's called the corpus callosum, which is a network of neural connections that connects the two sides of our brain. And the decision was made in the 1970s that severing this corpus callosum would help her survive and help her to cure her epileptic fits. And so she decided to undergo this very lengthy and dangerous kind of surgery, and she underwent it in June of 1979. And she became one of, roughly speaking, I believe, a dozen people who have undergone this surgery. Now, fortunately, the surgery did actually cure her of her epilepsy, and so she was able to live a much more normal life thereafter. Well, normal to an extent. Now, what would you expect might have happened to her after this kind of very serious surgery? Well, we know that the brain is a distributed network, distributed over the two lobes, the two halves of the brain, that they communicate together, and that therefore if you severed this communication link between the two halves of the brain, what you might end up doing is creating essentially two separate selves. And that seems to have been exactly what happened. Although, again, she was cured of the epilepsy, nevertheless, she had a number of pretty severe problems from then on. One example that she talks of is that when she would go into, say, the grocery store to pick out food for the day, she would find that her two hands would be struggling with each other to pick out various items. Her one hand would pick one thing, the other hand would try to stop it or pick something separate. When she was trying to get ready in the morning, when she was trying to get dressed, she said it would sometimes take her hours because each of her hands would be picking at different clothing for her. And she would describe this situation as that her right hand was picking out what she wanted, but her left hand was sort of independently picking out, so it seemed from her point of view, what it wanted. Now, it's hard accurately to describe what's going on here, either from the outside, that is from the third-person perspective, or frankly from the first-person perspective, that is to say from Vicky's own perspective. It's very difficult to describe this. But what we can say is that we know from a long history of observing brain injuries of various kinds that the two sides of our brain are set up such that each side is responsible for the opposite half of the body. So, for example, our left hand is being run, more or less, by the right side of our brain, and the right hand is run by the left side of the brain, and that's true for each half of our body down the middle. So in any event, after this surgery, Vicky was asked any number of questions over a period of years to try to figure out what had happened with her. One of the things that she would talk about, as I've mentioned, is that the right hand seemed to be her hand. The left hand didn't seem to be her hand. Well, what we know is that the right hand is run by the left side of the brain. And the left side of the brain is the brain mostly, that is to say, more or less responsible for our linguistic abilities. So what's happening is that when we hear Vicky talking about her side of the body, that is her right hand being her hand, what we're really hearing is her linguistic brain, that is to say, the left side of her brain, talking to us because it has the ability to speak. It has linguistic abilities. Whereas the right side of her brain, which is responsible for her left hand, doesn't have the same abilities, so can't speak. And of course, she only has one mouth and one set of vocal cords, so it's not really possible, or so it seems, for both sides of her brain to speak of their own experiences. That is to say, the right side of Vicky's brain is comparatively mute. It doesn't have the same capabilities to speak, and so we don't get to hear its side of the story. Now we may ask, does it really have a side to the story? Does it have its own thoughts and ideas? Can it comprehend things? Well, we can do experiments that actually resolve that it can. Now, I've already talked about how the left hand would pick out things in the grocery store or pick out clothing, so that would give us some reason to believe it has its side of the story. But what scientists did was to devise very clever experiments to highlight these facts. One of these experiments, a very famous one, was to set her up in front of a screen and flash words to different sides of her visual field. Because it so happens that, indeed, just like one side of our body is run by one side of our brain and the other, so too that's the fact with the visual field. So the right side of the visual field is being monitored by the left side of the brain, and the left visual field by the right side of the brain. And so what they would do is to flash words at different sides of these visual fields to determine what kind of understanding was going on. When they would flash a word, let's say face, to the left visual field, to the right visual field, Vicky would say, I see the word face. Now, when they flashed a word to the left visual field, Vicky would say that she did not see anything. However, her left hand would draw a face because her right visual field had seen the word. It was not able to speak. It did not have the control over the vocal cords in the mouth to do that, but it certainly understood the word because it was able to draw a face. Now, this sort of operation, and many other similar kinds of experiments and operations over the years, have demonstrated how incredibly malleable our ordinary self is, our ordinary sense of self is, under extreme kinds of conditions, the kinds of conditions that we don't ordinarily see. We can see, in fact, that one consciousness, one self, can be divided into two. That is to say, consciousness, or the self, is divisible. Which brings us to the topic, really, of today's video, which is about the vagueness of the self. Now, we ordinarily expect the self to be solid, to be unchanging, to be indivisible in a sense. So it's deeply unsettling when we find that the self actually is malleable in so many ways. Now, classic examples of the vagueness of ordinary objects like tables or chariots involves their so-called identity conditions. That is to say, when can we say that something qualifies as a chair or a chariot? People in philosophy will talk about this as vagueness as a property of predicates, that is to say, words rather than objects. I'm going to leave that whole discussion aside because it gets a little bit too far into the weeds here. We'll talk about the vagueness of objects. That is, when can we say they begin? When can we say they end? What can we say exactly qualifies as such and such a thing? For example, a chair or a chariot. Chariot being a very famous example in early Buddhism as representing the idea of a self. A self is like a chariot made up of parts. So in Vicky's case, the two selves that existed after the operation, neither of them really existed before. They're both very different from the self that existed before the operation. Now, when can we say that these two separate selves began? Well, presumably they began with the operation itself, but precisely where during that operation they began, that's kind of a vague matter. We can't say specifically. And this brings up the whole question of the origination, the beginning of things, the beginning in particular of selves. When does a chariot begin? Is there a specific moment in time that a pile of wood becomes a chariot, or, as we're more prone to think, is it something of a vague matter, that there isn't a specific moment in time when we can say the chariot began, it sort of more or less began over a period of time. The same question arises with the origination of human life. When can we say a human life, or a person, that is to say a sentient being, began? Now, many contemporary Christians will say that it began with what was known as the moment of conception. Some Buddhists will say this as well. That is to say, some Buddhists will say that it's the moment of conception when the aggregates, the causal relation from the aggregates from the prior lifetime influence this one, again at that very moment. But there are problems with this understanding of the literal origination of sentient life. To begin with, the moment of conception really, it seems like something that's quite short, like a moment, an instant, but in fact we know that conception is a process, an extremely complicated process, and while it occurs over a relatively short period of time, there's an enormous amount going on during that process. Precisely where in that process does conception originate? Where in this process does the soul enter the egg? It's difficult to say. It seems like, again, a vague matter, a matter that can't be pinned down to a particular moment in time. Also, if we assume that this ensoulment does happen during conception, there are further problems. For example, we know of the case of identical twins, where we have two people who are born of the same fertilized egg. If ensoulment happens at conception, then what happens with the other twin? We've only got one self and we have two people. Where does the other twin get its self from, its soul from, if this is a question of ensoulment from a Christian perspective, let's say? Or does the second twin perhaps not have a soul at all, and then which is which? There also are more interesting cases of what are known as chimeras. That is to say that certain beings, certain animals, both human and other animals, are the products of two separate eggs that fuse in the womb and become a single individual. So again, if this ensoulment process, if this creation of a sentient being occurs at conception, what we have are two separate beings in one single body. And this seems a very strange state of affairs, in particular since people who are chimeras don't have any indication of it. They live perfectly normal lives, and in fact, they wouldn't know about this without having certain kinds of genetic tests done. To many of us, it seems more credible to say that the person, the sentient life, originates with the development and maturation of the central nervous system. But this development and maturation is once again a vague process, occurring over a period of months at the very least. It takes a long time to mature the central nervous system, and there's no particular moment during that process where we can definitively say, okay, here is when a sentient life begins, here is when ensoulment begins. Indeed, neurobehavioral, morphological, neurochemical, and pharmacological evidence suggests that the brain remains under construction during adolescence. It's well established that the brain undergoes a rewiring process that is not complete until approximately 25 years of age. That is to say that our brain continues maturing through our early 20s. It is a lengthy process. At the very beginning, of course, we might say it's a matter of months, but in its entirety, the maturation of the central nervous system takes 25 years. So this is, again, a very vague process. Now, what we've been discussing is the vagueness at the beginning of sentient life, where we can say, or if we can say that there is a beginning, a moment that is an instant in time. Now let's turn to consider the possibility of sentience over life. That is to say, what counts as a sentient life and what does not. We know, as we've just discussed, that seems like we can divide one person into two and have two separate sentient beings in one head. But how far can we take that? What counts as being complex enough and the right kind of complexity to be sentient, to be a self? In a prior video, I discussed this problem when it came to the issue of artificial intelligences, the AI systems that we see around us now, these chatbots and so on. What I said in that video is that it seems as though the AI systems that are around us now aren't really quite up to being considered sentient. They're not quite up to being considered a self. But it's a vague matter. They're somewhere in between. In other words, there are certain things that it's clear are not sentient, and there are other things that it's clear are sentient. For example, we can say that a thermostat or a tree or a rock is not sentient. A human is. But these AI systems seem to be somewhere in this uncomfortable middle ground, which is why they're so unsettling to many of us. Once again, this is a vague matter. Similarly, if we go down the phylogenetic tree of life, once again, we know that humans are sentient. We know at least that, or believe that trees are not. That's certainly the case on a Buddhist understanding, that plants are not sentient. But there's a huge range, we might say a continuum of different kinds of creatures along this scale, along this phylogenetic tree. And precisely where are we going to say that sentience begins and ends? Is there a precise dividing line, or rather is it once again a vague matter? That in some ways some things are sort of sentient and some things in other ways are not, that there's a large kind of gray middle ground where we can't say specifically whether something is sentient or not. It may make as little sense to pinpoint an instant when sentience begins or a particular place on the phylogenetic tree where sentience arises, as it would be to pinpoint a particular moment in time or particular kind of complexity to make something a chariot. A pile of wood is not a chariot, but there isn't an instant in time when we can say that's when the chariot begins, or that is something that's precisely complex enough to be a chariot and no less. So we've discussed vagueness at the beginning of sentience. We've discussed vagueness as to what counts as sentience during a lifetime. But now let's turn a little bit anyway to sentience at the end. Is there a precise moment in time when we can say sentience leaves the body? In the words of Camille Wortman, who is a psychologist, clinical psychologist who has studied this matter, or studied the process of death, what she has to say is, it's becoming increasingly apparent that dying is a process, not an event. Now, this event-like nature of death is perhaps most clear in cases where people have progressive states of cognitive impairment, such as Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia. There we can see, over a period of months or years, how the self breaks down, how the self is lost little by little as the person descends farther and farther into this kind of disease of death, basically. And where precisely does sentience leave along this continuum? It can be impossible to precisely say. All that we see is, again, this lengthy process that eventuates in physical death of the body, But again, the physical death of the body is itself a kind of a process that takes time. So we've been looking at vagueness at the beginning, vagueness in the middle, vagueness at the end. The problems involved with vagueness are known in philosophy as Sorites paradoxes. Sorites is the word for piles in ancient Greek, and the general idea is that it's a paradox because we know that one grain of sand does not make a pile. We also believe that adding one grain of sand to something that's not a pile already is not going to make it a pile. But if we iterate that process of thinking over and over again, let's say 10,000 times, we'll get the wrong answer, because 10,000 grains of sand is a pile. So it seems like there's some error in thinking here. We've got a paradox on our hands. A similar problem from ancient Greece is known as the ship of Theseus. Theseus had a very famous ship, and it was so famous that it was kept in the harbor. And every once in a while, the Greeks would replace the boards as they became waterlogged or rotten. So over time, the entire ship was replaced little by little. And one of the questions that philosophers asked was, is this still the ship of Theseus? If it isn't, where did it stop being the ship of Theseus? If it is even though all of its individual parts have been replaced. Of course, we know the same thing is true of our physical body. Everything is always being replaced. British philosopher Thomas Hobbes asked a separate question, which is, I think, even a little deeper, which is to say, what if the ancient Greeks had retained all of the parts that they had taken off the ship of Theseus, and after a time rebuilt the ship with those old parts? At that time, we would have two ships of Theseus. We would have the one in the harbor with relatively new boards, and we would have the one in the construction house, let's say, made up of old boards. Which would be the ship of Theseus? Well, we might say there'd be two ships of Theseus. How is that possible? It seems actually somewhat similar to the question about Vicky, where one person becomes two. Here, one ship becomes two. Now, contemporary philosopher Derek Parfit came up with many such thought experiments that he thought revealed Buddhist-type conclusions about the nature of personal identity, the nature of the self. Indeed, he did think in his very famous book about this question, Reasons and Persons, about the question of Vicky, about these split-brain patients, and had a number of things to say about them. But he's perhaps most famous, Derek Parfit is perhaps most famous for his thought experiments around what we might call Star Trek-type beaming. Now, a lot of us may be familiar with the television show Star Trek and how they would beam from place to place. This is a technology from the far future where they would stand on a platform and someone would press a button. They would be, their body would be taken apart into its individual components and beamed, that is to say, sent at the speed of light a far distance away, maybe to a planet's surface, reconstructed on the planet's surface, and then they would do their hour-long show, and then they'd be beamed back to the starship. It was a quick way of moving around. Now, what Derek Parfit noted is that we ordinarily conceive of this beaming process as retaining personal identity, that we're the same person on the planet's surface that we were on the platform on the starship, and vice versa. Now, there are a number of episodes of Star Trek where there are malfunctionings with the beaming apparatus, but they never quite get, at least in the ones that I've seen, they never quite get to Derek Parfit's conclusion. Maybe there have been some that have come out after I stopped watching Star Trek, but in any event, what he asks is, well, what happens if this beaming device malfunctions? It creates you off on the planet's surface, but it doesn't destroy you on the platform. So now we have two individuals that are both claiming to be Doug Smith, right? They both have my same personality, they both have my same memories, both look like me, they have the same body. Which one is me? Now, we might say, oh, okay, it's clearly the one on the platform, because that one, it's sort of more natural. That one hasn't been destroyed. The one on the platform is clearly, I'm sorry, the one on the planet is clearly some kind of construction. Maybe that's what we want to say. But what if the device created two of me by accident on the planet's surface? Now, in Star Trek, if this happens, it's usually a good Kirk and an evil Kirk or something like that. So these aren't identical. But in this case, let's assume they are identical. It's the same person. That is to say, identical physically and mentally. Which one is the real me? These kinds of thought experiments, and others besides, like the ones I've been discussing, and again, others that he discusses in his book, led Derek Parfit to give up personal identity as important. All that he cared about, all that he thought mattered, were the causally connected stream of mental and physical events that made up a person. These causally connected streams could be divided. They actually potentially could reconnect at some point in the future. We could reconnect two parts of a person's brain, or connect to fertilized eggs and so on. These can be divided, can be reconnected. They are paradigmatically vague, like streams. Again, a stream can divide, a stream can reconnect. When is it we can say that a trickle of water becomes a stream? There is no specific place. That's again a vague matter of when a stream begins, when a stream ends, what even counts as a stream. Vagueness, the vagueness of objects, the vagueness of our words, is really a very profound and important thing to keep in conception when thinking about personal identity, when thinking about the nature of the self or non-self. So what we see here are some deep and profound conclusions that we can make from recent scientific investigation into the nature of the self, looking at its ability to be split, looking at its origins, looking at its endings, looking at what counts as a self. All of these, and these thought experiments as well from contemporary philosophers, demonstrate the vague nature of the self. Selves can be split. They have vague beginnings. They have vague endings. They have vague identity conditions. Now, how do we reconcile all of this vagueness with a traditional idea of Buddhist rebirth? Is there going to be a specific time at which, both at the beginning and at the ending, and at what counts as being the sort of thing that can be reborn or not? Now, to be clear, it's always possible with these kinds of vague examples that I've been talking about to simply bite the bullet and to say, yes, we can't tell, but there is a specific time at which the person begins. There's always a specific time at which the person ends. There's always a specific sort of thing that counts as sentience and non-sentience, even if in all of these cases we can't necessarily tell because it seems to us vague. Again, always possible to bite the bullet there, but to me, the biting the bullet seems somehow unsatisfying. It seems ad hoc. Now, in some early suttas, the Buddha gets into some of these kinds of questions, these kind of paradoxical issues, and I discussed some of this in a prior video. I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below and up here on the screen, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.